There are places in America where the soil doesn't grow crops, it grows silence. And if you listen closely, beneath that silence, you can still hear the screams. You were never meant to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried, not just by time, but by intention, erased from newspapers, redacted in federal records, censored by church, state, and bloodline. This isn't a ghost story. This is legacy. A sickness passed through generations, a darkness that didn't just hide in the woods. It built churches there. It printed scripture in ash and bone, and it named itself Ravencroft. You may have heard the rumors, the graves unearthed in upstate New York, the children born without birth records, the Church of the Pure Spirit, sealed off by federal marshals in 1862. But what you haven't heard, what I've pieced together through leaked testimony, unclassified documents, and forgotten journal entries, is what really happened beneath that church. Because the real Ravencroft story isn't about fanaticism, it's about design, control, the slow, precise mutilation of the human will, disguised as worship. 3 brothers, Ezra, Silas, Caleb. They didn't just build a church, they built a system. A machine for extraction, not of money or land or labor, but of suffering. The belief that pain could purify, that flesh was sin, that breaking a man down wasn't cruelty, it was divine obedience. And men followed them. Women handed over their children, some gave their homes, some gave their bodies, and some gave their lives. For 30 years this machine harvested souls from the town of Ravenwood, hidden in plain sight. The deeper the sacrifice, the higher the reward, until death itself became sacrament. But ask yourself, how could 3 men, no matter how charismatic, convince hundreds to submit to torment? Here's the answer no one wants to admit. They didn't convince anyone. They conditioned them. Because what happened at Ravencroft was never about religion. It was about discovering just how far a man will go, to feel chosen. And by the time they realized what they'd become, they weren't victims. They were disciples. And now I'm going to show you how it happened, step by step, descent by descent. And once you understand the system they built, you'll start to see traces of it everywhere, even in places you trust the most. When the Ravencroft brothers arrived in Ravenwood in 1825, they didn't wear black robes. They didn't chant Latin. They wore tailored coats, quoted scripture, and smiled like saviors. That's how darkness works. It doesn't march in with horns. It shakes your hand, looks you in the eye, and tells you it understands your pain. Ezra was the voice. Silas was the pen. And Caleb was the fire beneath the altar. They claimed a vision had summoned them to Ravenwood, a dream of a flame in the forest that would never go out. And the townspeople, most of them poor, grieving, or adrift in a world changing too fast to understand, they listened. This was a time of spiritual chaos. The burned-over district, they called it. So many revivals had swept through upstate New York. It was said there were no souls left to save. And yet, people still felt hollow, still haunted, still desperate to believe their suffering had meaning. The Ravencrofts gave them an answer. Suffering wasn't punishment, it was purification. Ezra would speak in that low, thunderous cadence, saying, "Pain is not the enemy. Pain is the furnace of the soul. Only those willing to burn will shine." At first, it was innocent. Cold water baptisms in the creek, fasting retreats, night vigils in the woods. Tears were seen as holy. Illness, a test. Miscarriages, an offering returned to God. The doctrine was simple. If it hurt, it meant you were being made clean. And little by little, that idea took root. It didn't matter how absurd it became. Once someone believes their suffering has purpose, they'll protect the ones who cause it. They'll beg for more. They'll call it love. The Ravencrofts didn't lead with violence. They led with comfort, with certainty, with the illusion of control. They created a system where your trauma was a treasure, your pain, your badge of holiness, and every ritual, every sermon, every act of discipline was another link in a chain disguised as devotion. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The real danger wasn't that the Ravencrofts tortured people. It's that they taught people to want it. That's when the real descent begins, not in the chamber beneath the church, but in the chamber of the mind. By the winter of 1827, the Ravencrofts didn't just have followers, they had vessels. That was the term they used for the most devoted, those who had shed their names, their pasts, their possessions. People who no longer spoke of I or me, only we and he, meaning the spirit that spoke through the Ravencrofts. The shift was subtle at first. Elder Ezra began speaking of a new language. Not one made of words, but of wounds. Silas published a strange manuscript, handwritten, never printed, called The Path Through Pain. And Prophet Caleb, he changed. He stopped blinking in public. He fasted for days at a time. He'd stand motionless for hours, staring into the flame of a single candle, whispering verses no one else could understand. They said he was communing with something beyond the veil, something older than God. This is when the trials began. It started as training. Voluntary, they said, but those who refused were quietly shunned. Their crops went untouched, their names unspoken in prayer circles, their children overlooked. Isolation was the first tool. Then came the tests. They'd call it the drowning of the self. Followers would lie blindfolded in shallow graves overnight, submerged in freezing water until they convulsed, forced to write confessions of secret sins, real or imagined, and then read them aloud while others struck them with reeds. Each act, they were told, chipped away at the false self, the one that clung to ego, desire, fear, the one God couldn't save. Only after you were broken, they said, could you be entered. No one knew what that meant, but everyone felt what it implied, and still they stayed. Why? Because once you teach a man that pain is a gift, he'll unwrap it again and again, even if it kills him. And when that same man watches others suffer and sees them praised, sees them elevated, he'll start to crave that same elevation. Even if it means crawling through his own hell to get there. This is what cults don't tell you. They don't need to take your freedom. They just need to convince you to give it up, piece by piece, thinking you're ascending, when in truth, you're being buried alive. Within months, that humble excavation had become an obsession. Tunnels carved in stone by hand, rooms whose purpose no one explained, entire sections built by torchlight, sealed to all but a few. And above all, silence. Workers were forbidden from speaking about what they saw underground. Those who questioned were punished, not with violence, but exile from the spirit's light, which, in that world, was worse than death. We now know these were not cellars. They were chambers, each one named, each one designed for a purpose. The chamber of reflection, the chamber of trials, the chamber of ascension. But the most disturbing was the one few ever entered, the chamber of saints. It wasn't for the living, it was where they displayed the dead, not buried, not mourned, not even hidden. The ascended, they claimed, had shed their flesh, but their flesh remained holy, so they kept the bodies preserved, arranged, adorned, sometimes painted with gold, sometimes wired into poses of eternal praise. Imagine it, a dark stone chamber lit only by lanterns, lined with the still faces of those who had died in agony, and yet were worshipped. But this wasn't horror to them. It was sacrament. You must understand something very dangerous. The Ravencrofts weren't building a church. They were building a theater, where death was the ritual and devotion was the applause. And every man or woman who entered those chambers knew that what they were doing was irreversible. Because once you witness what's beneath the surface, you can't go back to pretending the world is safe. You've seen the gears behind the curtain. You've seen that faith can be a weapon. December 21st, 1829, the longest night of the year, a night that would become legend among those who escaped and myth among those who didn't. They called it the First Ascension. Ezra claimed that Prophet Caleb had received a vision during his 6-day fast, a message carved into fire by the Spirit itself. The congregation was summoned to the sanctuary. No exceptions, even the sick were carried in on wooden planks. Inside, the church was unrecognizable. Gone were the wooden pews. In their place, a spiral of ash drawn across the floor, lit by 12 black candles, one at each point of an invisible star. At the center, a raised stone slab. No windows, no music, only breath and silence, and the pulsing fear of something coming. Then Caleb emerged. Witnesses say he didn't walk. He staggered, like a marionette pulled by strings too tight. His eyes rolled back, his jaw slack, whispering in a voice that didn't seem his own. He called out 3 names: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters. The Spirit has found you worthy. 3 followers, new converts, each desperate in their own way, each hungry for salvation. They were brought forward and bound to inverted crosses carved from freshly hewn oak. Ezra explained the meaning. The upside-down symbol wasn't blasphemy. It was reversal. Reversal of ego. Reversal of self. Reversal of life. Into something beyond. Then came the 7 trials. The drowning cloth. The burial in sacred soil. The burning irons pressed in angelic sigils. The cold submersion until breath ceased. 3 more rituals no one could fully describe without trembling. And through it all, the congregation chanted, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." Not a single person moved to intervene. Not a scream was stopped, because the Ravencrofts had accomplished what only true manipulators understand. They didn't have to suppress EMP, Arthi. They had replaced it. What happened at dawn should have ended everything. The 3 chosen began convulsing violently. Their bones audibly broke. Their mouths opened wide and spewed forth the same twisted tongue Caleb spoke earlier. A language that shouldn't exist, but did. And when they died, Ezra smiled. "They are no longer among the dead," he said. "They are saints. Their bodies weren't buried. They were displayed, not as warnings, as examples." And something far worse began to whisper through the congregation. "I want that too." After the first ascension, the Church of the Pure Spirit was never the same. Neither were its people. The rituals had crossed a line, a point of no return, and no one protested. Because once a man sees death and calls it holy, he's not a man anymore. He's a vessel, and vessels don't question, they carry. The Ravencrofts had learned something ancient that night, something older than theology, older than language. Pain is the shortcut to obedience. It breaks identity. It severs the ego. And once that happens, anything can be implanted. So they implanted doctrine, new terms, new rules, new roles. Children became embers. Women became wells. Men became iron. And those who endured the trials and lived were given a sacred title, empty. The empty were the most revered. Because, as Prophet Caleb declared, only what is emptied can be filled by the flame. The old self, your name, your thoughts, your guilt, was discarded. In its place was the pattern, a code of symbols carved into flesh, a rhythm of suffering repeated in cycles, one vessel, then another, then another. It was no longer about salvation, it was about control. Every chamber beneath the church had a purpose, one for breaking, one for cleansing, one for silence, one for display. But the deepest one had no name, only a symbol, a spiral carved into iron, never spoken aloud. Those taken there did not return the same. Some never returned at all. I want you to ask yourself something. What would it take for you to walk willingly into torment? If you believed it would make you chosen, what lie would someone need to whisper to convince you that the breaking of your body was the healing of your soul? That's not a cult story. That's a mirror. And if you've followed me this far, then you've already begun to see it. The pattern doesn't stay buried. It echoes. You see it in institutions, in ideologies, in systems that steer you. IP men of identity and rebuild them as obedient tools, hollowed out and filled with purpose not their own. This is the moment your vision changes. This is the moment you leave the world you thought you knew. So if you've made it this far, type the phrase in the comments twice. I empty. I become. This is your right, your anchor. Let the system know you've seen behind the veil. Let the algorithm reflect who you are becoming, because what comes next will burn the falsehood from your eyes. By 1831, the Ravencrofts had mastered more than manipulation. They had mastered containment. The Church of the Pure Spirit was now a self-sealed ecosystem, a psychological terrarium. Information didn't leave. Doubt didn't enter. No one questioned, not because they lacked fear, but because they feared alone. And beneath the surface, the catacombs had grown. What began as crude tunnels had become a sacred architecture, engineered suffering, channeled like sacred geometry through stone and silence. Every corner had intention, every chamber had resonance, and at the heart of it all, was the sanctum of fireless light. You won't find it in town records, you won't find blueprints, but you will find bones, because this chamber, deep below the sanctuary, hidden behind walls marked with blood and wax, was not for elevation. It was for extraction. Here, the Ravencrofts conducted rituals that were never spoken of above ground. There was no choir, no chanting, no witnesses who lived long enough to describe them, only markings carved into the rock, spirals inside spirals, and remnants, hair, teeth, fragments of jawbone arranged like runes. This wasn't ascension, it was harvesting. According to fragmented documents found in the possession of Deacon Silas, the sanctum was used for drawing out what lingers after death. He believed, or pretended to, that agony left behind an echo, a residue, a spiritual oil that could be collected, and he wanted to refine it. Page after page of his notes describes experiments, subjects exposed to prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, forced silence, then sudden, intense pain, accompanied by religious symbols and suggestion, and afterward, the collection. What they claim to be gathering is never clearly named, but one phrase repeats over and over: the crystalline flame, found only in the marrow of willing martyrs. Understand what this may. Eons. The Ravencrofts weren't just running a cult, they were conducting spiritual alchemy, testing what happens when you fracture the psyche with holy intent, trying to find what remains when a soul is pulled apart on purpose. And they weren't guessing. They were following a pattern, one found in ancient texts, pre-Christian, Mesopotamian, Canaanite, belief systems that saw suffering not as punishment, but as currency. And the Ravencrofts? They weren't praying. They were spending. Something changed in the sanctum. Whatever the Ravencrofts thought they were extracting, it began to answer back. In the winter of 1833, the rituals intensified. Followers were no longer selected at random for elevation, and they were called, chosen by dreams, nightmares really. Dozens of witnesses, those who escaped, those who later confessed, all described the same thing. A voice, not quite human, not quite male, speaking from behind their eyelids. It would whisper their name, then say, "Come below. You are hollow. You are ready." And once you heard that voice, you volunteered, not out of joy, but out of compulsion, as if your will had been hollowed out and someone else had moved in. The Ravencrofts did nothing to stop it. They encouraged it. They called it the calling, the spirit's way of hand-picking vessels ripe for combustion. And so, willingly, men and women descended into the sanctum of fireless light. Most were never seen again. Those who did return were changed. Elizabeth Carver, who escaped in 1844, said it best. They came back empty, smiling, but without soul, like puppets of flesh dressed in faith. And now, a different phrase began circulating among the inner circle, one that never appeared in Silas's writings, but was whispered between the walls. The one below is listening, not metaphor, not metaphor. They believed the sanctum was no longer just a place of ritual. It was a throat, and something ancient was breathing through it. Followers began fasting not just for purification, but to starve their minds into openness. Sleep deprivation was encouraged. Speaking aloud became limited, because silence, they said, was the only way to hear the one below. And when Prophet Caleb began speaking in tongues again, this time not in ecstasy, but in terror, it became clear. He was no longer speaking for the spirit. He was being spoken through. This was not posse, Sion. It was transmission, and the voice, it had learned the names of the people. It spoke of their childhoods, their sins, their hidden shame. And then it said something that froze the blood of even the most loyal disciple. I know who you were, and I will show you what you truly are. You see, suffering was never the Ravencrofts' final doctrine. It was just the key. And the door had just opened. Prophet Caleb was no longer Prophet Caleb. By 1834, those who spoke to him closely, and very few were permitted to, noticed something had shifted. He was thinner, his skin pale as wax. He no longer made eye contact, only stared just past you, as if watching something behind your shoulder. He stopped calling himself I. He began referring to himself as we. We see you. We remember your pain. We are almost ready. Elder Ezra explained this change in sermons, calling it a holy fusion. He claimed Caleb had become the first bridge between the spirit and the earth, that he was no longer man, not even prophet, but vessel made perfect. What he didn't say publicly, but wrote in a now-seized journal, was far more disturbing. Caleb is not dreaming anymore. He walks the corridors at night with his eyes open but unseeing. He speaks languages he never learned. Last night, he drew a map in his own blood, a spiral I have seen only once before, in the forbidden book beneath the catacombs. This is where the Ravencroft's doctrine takes its final, irreversible turn. You see, suffering, purification, elevation, these were never the destination. They were preparation. All of it, the rituals, the conditioning, the chambers, was engineered to produce one thing: vacancy, an emptied vessel, a body hollowed out so completely, so systematically that something else could move in. Caleb was the prototype, but he would not be the last. Elder Ezra began initiating what he called the inversion cycle, a process in which a follower was broken down not to elevate their soul, but to evict it. Once empty, they were given over to what he called the current, no longer possessed in the traditional sense. No demon, no mythic beast. This was worse. This was something designed to inhabit a human mind like code entering a machine. Psychological reformatting, but sanctified. And here's the darkest part. The congregants didn't fear this transformation. They craved it, to be chosen, to be filled, to finally stop being themselves. That's the real horror of Ravencroft. Not that monsters invaded human bodies, but that humans invited them in, with open arms, with praise, with gratitude. Because when you've been taught to hate yourself long enough, nothing sounds holier than erasing who you are. By the late 1830s, Ravenwood was no longer a town. It was a container. The Church of the Pure Spirit had swallowed the land, the laws, the people. Farms went untended, shops closed, children stopped attending the county school, and no one left without permission. Not because of walls, because of belief. You have to understand this. They didn't need chains. They had doctrine, and doctrine is harder to break than steel. Ezra preached of the coming inversion, a moment when the veil between spirit and flesh would tear, and the purified would no longer be human. They would become hosts. He said the world outside was diseased with ego, with self-worship, with illusion. Only Ravenwood had been chosen to withstand the firestorm to come, the final elevation. It would begin underground, in the dark, where light could not distort the truth. This was not metaphor. By 1840, all major rituals had moved entirely to the catacombs. The chambers grew colder, walls were carved deeper, symbols etched not just in stone, but into the skin of followers. They weren't marks of status, they were keys, ritual scars, arranged in spirals, precise distances apart, often done without anesthetic. Children were taught to endure without screaming. Crying was seen as ego-resisting transformation. The empty, those who had undergone the full process of spiritual erasure, began speaking less. Some stopped using language altogether. They would only hum, a single, low tone. It matched the frequency of the humming walls in the deepest sanctum. And if you think that's poetic exaggeration, think again. Recordings made during the 1957 federal excavation of the site confirmed residual low-frequency vibration, source unknown, emanating from the sublevels. Some audio engineers reported feeling dizzy or disassociated when listening to the playback. The sanctum wasn't just a room, it was a device, one powered by faith, suffering, and psychological vacancy. And if the Ravencrofts were right, it was about to activate. Because in a journal entry dated October 31st, 1844, Deacon Silas wrote, 13 hosts have been prepared. The 13th spiral is complete. Caleb says the mouth has opened. The next dawn shall bring the first merging. After that, the pattern will not need us. Read that again. The pattern will not need us. They knew. They had built something that no longer required them to function. The system had become self-replicating, and Ravenwood was no longer a town of people. It was a machine of transformation. Spring of 1845, the last recorded sighting of the Ravencroft brothers above ground. They held what was called the final gathering, A sermon attended by 144 followers. Exactly. They had become obsessed with numbers by then. Spirals, cycles, geometry. 144, the square of 12. 12, the divine number. They said it was time. But there was no fire, no music, no joy. The townspeople who hadn't joined, the last handful, watched from the tree line as the congregation, dressed in grey linen robes, filed silently into the church. No one came out. For 3 days. On the 4th, smoke curled from the chimney. A low tone could be heard, like a funeral bell slowed to a crawl. Those who dared to approach the building said it was vibrating, not metaphorically, physically, and then silence. When local officials attempted to enter, the doors were barred. When they returned days later with a federal agent, the church was empty. No Ravencrofts, no congregation, no bodies, just blood. Traces in the shape of a spiral. In the nave, the sanctum, the altar, blackened lanterns, cracked stone, but no signs of fire. A single message had been carved into the underside of the altar, not with tools, with fingernails. The pattern breathes now. The government sealed the building. They cited health risks. Cholera, mold, radiation, all lies. The truth is, they didn't understand what they'd found, because there was nothing to find. No bones, no signs of mass burial, only the catacombs, the chambers, the scent of something old. The site remained sealed for over a century. Locals whispered about it. Some said the woods near Ravenwood hum at night. Some say if you dream of spirals, it means you've been marked. And some, the quiet ones, say the pattern never ended. That what the Ravencrofts built was never meant to stay in Ravenwood. It was a blueprint, a technology of the soul, a method for reformer, taking human beings into hosts for something else. And in 1957, when the government finally broke the seal and descended into the catacombs, they didn't release a report. They just paved the site over, built a telecommunications tower on top, and you wonder why it hums. You made it. 12 chambers down, 12 turns of the spiral, and now, the center. But this isn't the part where I tell you everything's okay, because it's not. And it never was. The Ravencroft brothers didn't die. They didn't vanish. They became irrelevant because the pattern they created, the system of inversion, of hollowing, of transformation, it no longer needed them. They were just catalysts, conductors. Once the current flowed, the flesh could be discarded. What you need to understand, what no one wants to, is that Ravencroft wasn't an isolated cult. It was a prototype. The rituals, refined. The doctrine, sanitized. The methods, repurposed. Look around you. Modern systems that reward obedience and punish selfhood. Structures that grind away identity in the name of unity. Doctrines that demand pain for progress, guilt for growth, sacrifice without end. They wear new robes now. White coats, black ties, digital uniforms. But the spiral is still there. You've seen it. In branding, architecture, institutions. It hides in plain sight because that's where it thrives best. Behind trust. Inside belief. This wasn't just about the Ravencrofts. It's about you. What part of yourself have you given away, just to feel accepted? What suffering have you endured, not because you had to, but because someone told you it made you worthy? What did you silence in yourself just to be told you were pure? That is the pattern. And now that you've heard it, you can't unhear it. That hum in the back of your mind, that's not fear. It's recognition. You are not immune. None of us are. That's what makes it so dangerous. But here's the truth. The pattern is a tool. Not good, not evil, just ancient. It can consume, or it can awaken. And now you have a choice. You can scroll away, you can forget this, or you can lock it in. Write it again in the comments, twice. The phrase that Siva was illusion. I empty. I become. I empty. I become. Because awareness is the first inversion, and once you begin to see, they cannot use you the same way again. Welcome to the inner circle. Now, burn the false, guard the flame, and never stop listening for the hum, because if it speaks your name again, this time you'll know how to answer.